Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. As always, it's my pleasure to have back with me today Charles Hugh Smith, well-followed and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Welcome back, Charles.
Thank you, Gordon. It's always a pleasure.
Time once again to share some ideas. Any key themes in your recent writings that you want to share with our listeners before we start?
I guess I've been writing about how the whole economic and financial systems have been backed into a corner, and there's just no more room to run. And like I wrote about student loans, that it's the whole system is so maxed out that you're not going to get another trillion or two of student loans, and so that these systems are going to start breaking down because there's no room left for the strategy that they've been pursuing since 2008. And I think today's agenda is a good overview of that process.
Charles, as I normally do, I need to stress with our new viewers that this is not an interview. We do these videos simply as a way of us productively dialoguing the important trends which we are identifying and make our discussions available to the public for those that might be interested or want to contribute comments, which, by the way, we read and truly welcome. Today our talk is a follow-on from our last 3 sessions, and we feel it important to continue to talk about exactly how risk is being transferred to the unsuspecting. In the last video session entitled "It Always Ends the Same Way," we focused primarily on the financial instruments that were being used. In this session, Charles and I want to talk more about how it has been done from a strategic perspective. As such, we want to discuss the topics I'm showing here and go through them. Charles, any comments before we begin this agenda?
No, only that I'm very enthused about this topic because I think the average investor might not be fully aware of just how much risk has been piled up in the system, and that's what we're talking about today.
The risk is bigger than I saw in 1986. It's bigger than the dot-com bubble implosion, and it's bigger than 2008 by an order of magnitude. I've never seen risk to this degree. That does not mean that it's about to collapse. I'm not suggesting that. You need to be very, very concerned at this point about risk, and you have risk protection in place and getting advice on how to do that. We've been talking about, Charles, crony capitalism, and how capitalism itself has been changing as a result for a long time now. We started warning about the serious advancements of crony capitalism in 2014 as the U.S. debt began exploding with quantitative easing and how it was being taken advantage of. In September of 2014, we put out a video I'm showing here specifically entitled, "Why is crony capitalism happening?" And as you can see from the graphic on the left, which is taken from the cover of the UK's Economist, we weren't alone at that time in expressing this concern. You recall that video, Charles, at all?
Yes, I do.
It was we did a lot of them, but I remember this one very, very clearly. At that time, it fit actually naturally in a roadmap we'd been exploring since 2008 financial crisis, a roadmap where we felt the forces of globalization and elements of social change were pushing us towards increasing statism in the form of harder totalitarian dictates, control, and social suppression of our freedoms up here on the top right corner of this chart. It certainly appears we got this right when we look around today and additionally realize what we've witnessed in just the last 12 months alone. And it's just ominous, isn't it, Charles, what we see now to those comments that we were making back then?
It's like your roadmap is almost eerily prescient.
When I got it out and dusted it off, I thought, oh my goodness, we really did get that right.
Right. And though a lot of people are looking at the pandemic and the levels of control and looking at that as a driver, I think that what your chart is showing, that it's actually, never mind whether the pandemic happened or not. These mechanisms we're describing were already in full flower before the pandemic.
Precisely. precisely. In recent years, we haven't focused as much on crony capitalism, but that wasn't because of a lost concern, but frankly because there have been so many other developments occurring in parallel around it. But in that 2014 video, which by the way is still available on the Gordon T. Long YouTube channel, if for those that are interested, we outline in this chart here on the right what we felt was in front of us regarding crony capitalism in a post-financial crisis through to the next crisis, and a crisis I suspect we can now call officially the global COVID-19 pandemic crisis. So we knew there was another crisis coming. At that time, we warned, specifically, we warned that crony capitalism could be expected to mutate to fascism, where fascism was originally defined by Benito Mussolini as being the marriage of government and corporations. And as a result, government would take on and could be expected to take on an increasing role of controlled central planning, that there would be increasing alliances between government, banking, and corporations, and I dare suggest, like we've recently witnessed between big tech censorship and party policies. Frankly, I've been shadow banned on a couple of occasions now, and I don't know about you, Charles, but I think you've experienced it too. So we've seen it up close and personal, the two of us, that we'd increasingly feel government was no longer considered to be for we the people. We see it more focused on serving other stakeholders, and that instead of getting more for less, which is true capitalism, we would get less for more, which is what crony capitalism delivers. Charles, any comments on those observations we made back then?
Yeah, I just would pick up on the shadow banning as an example of what I call privatized totalitarianism. And so we're seeing a lot of repressive control by central states, but we're also seeing this marriage of corporations and government on another level of control. In other words, so now you can be banned and basically eliminated from the digital world by a private corporation, and you don't have any recourse because there's no judicial process to challenge your banning or your shadow banning. And so it's actually, if anything, it's worse than what we anticipated.
Yes, it is.
Because the corporations now control so much that that marriage between government and corporations, which of course we don't see, right? We don't get to see. We're not sitting in the meeting between Google and the NSA or whatever. It's all behind closed doors, and so that's where you could call it creeping fascism. You know, it's and so that's why it's difficult to detect, because we're not able to see behind the curtain.
Nor are we free to really talk about it without consequences, and I'll just leave it at that. Which is something we have to be very careful of. Today,
That's right.
And today, instead of crony capitalism, we have predatory capitalism. And Charles, I got to give you credit, because that's what you coined as, and I thought it was just absolutely perfect, because that's what it is. It's no longer crony; it's predator. And let me try and explain in my words the differences, at least as I see it. And this chart is the best I could really make to make it easy. Crony capitalism is about developing a quid pro quo or win-win arrangement that extracts wealth for corporations from the government and consumers. Predator capitalism is about taking it via exercising control, by making arbitrary decisions that advantage the corporation without a win for the other side. It is about a power shift. Large corporations are measured in trillions today, and founders are personally worth more than a vast array of sovereign countries. With this wealth comes untold power and influence. That's a fact. We witnessed the old truism that power corrupts, but absolute power absolutely corrupts. And it's important in today's discussion on risk to see that we've moved from the transfer of risk as best as possible, that is, corporations doing the best they can do at it, as we witnessed during the 2008 crisis in housing, to now what it is transfer of risk to the unsuspecting by force. The central bank's macroprudential policies of financial repression, which we've seen heavily since the mid 2005 on, and accelerated in 2008. Financial repression has fostered and allowed this, and it's going to increase quite significantly over the next number of years. Comments on that, Charles?
I think you've done an excellent job here of laying out the difference and why predator capitalism is especially dangerous to democracy. And there was a Foreign Affairs magazine article called "Monopoly versus Democracy," and you can tell by the choice of words that predator capitalism is basically using monopoly or quasi-monopoly or cartel power to impose a financial arrangement that benefits only one side. As you say, it's not a win-win, it's a win-lose.
We could easily list corporations that everybody would say, yep, you're right there, but we're best to refrain from that here today if we want to have this video with as broad a coverage as possible. But the forced transfer of risk can be considered as occurring on basically three dimensions. One, from capital to labor. Two, from the financial elite to the middle class. And three, from the protected insiders to the unprotected masses. That's at a very high level. That's fundamentally the strategy. Now, how do they do that? What are the tactics to that? We're now going to give you some specific examples of this and how they've been doing it steadily here for the last 10 years and more to come. And I'm going to let Charles, you take us through here, at least lead these as we go through these various examples of transfers.
We're all aware of these, and it's sort of like the drip, 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 right? That you think, okay, each one of these things has been eroding the middle class financial security, right? And so one, of course, is that pensions used to be, if you worked for private sector, you had a defined pension plan if you worked for a large company, and where you were guaranteed a pension of some size. And now that's been replaced with matching 401k type retirements, which puts all of the risk of basically playing the markets on the worker. And so the employee, of course, doesn't have the skill sets, and so they're basically gambling that their Wall Street manager of their 401k is going to somehow work miracles and make them rich before they retire. But of course, that's an extreme transfer of risk.
Just make a comment on
Sure.
that, Charles.
Yeah.
So the corporations have in mass went from contributory or defined benefits to contributory benefits, as you say. But what hasn't shifted is all the government employees in terms of public services have outstanding pensions, bigger and better than ever. And I'm not trying to say they don't deserve it or anything else. I'm trying to say a contrast here between the corporations who've got rid of them, but the government have kept them. The unions that are still in existence, primarily the trade unions have kept them, and those that are paid through government money, such as teachers, firemen, police, etc. All deserve pensions. Not saying that it don't, but we now have a two-class society. If you live off the government taxation system in some way, you have a very rich pension. And you can get it after 20 years or 24 years. If you don't, you're on your own. You are totally responsible, and somehow that 401k and what you can save and make on no interest has to pay your pension. So it's really creating a two-class system in here. But it's about the transfer of risk. The corporations have removed that risk from their books.
I'm glad you brought that up, Gordon. And we have discussed this in previous programs, that this two-tier system is creating a lot of social disorder, and that's where we're only seeing the start of that. But when you've created a protected class, and then an unprotected class, then you've created social divisions which cannot be papered over. And where I should ask you, Gordon, at some point in our discussion to talk about the one of the issues in this transfer to 401k is that because of the Federal Reserve's policies, there's no you can't earn any interest you get 1/10% interest on your safe retirement, or maybe 1%. And so the financial repression you described has really done in and loaded the 401k owners with risk, because they can't find any safe return.
There is none. And in fact, they're actually losing money on it because of the real value after inflation is far outstripping what they might potentially make on a nominal basis. And even professional managers are having troubles balancing that one. Ever mind the average citizen who's trying to go to work every single day. So the system is now set up for them to fail. I mean, they've got to be a genius to get or ungodly lucky. And right now, I'm sure I can hear people in the audience saying, well, Gord, I'm doing really, really well on my 401k. The market's been going great. I got nothing to complain about. And I say, absolutely been great. But remember, markets go down faster than they go up. And, they go down very, very fast, and it takes years for you to make back that money with a smaller amount. That's traditionally what happens with markets. And so you've got a lot, and this, without question, is a risky market that we're currently in. I'm not saying there's a crash coming. I'm just trying to say it's about transfer of risk. Obviously, corporations don't want to shoulder this risk, and banks aren't lending, which tells you they don't want to shoulder the risk. They see something coming.
The second item here is the transfer of healthcare. And of course, I've written many times, and we've discussed it, Gordon, that healthcare will bankrupt the United States all by itself, right? Because it just keeps rising as a percentage of the U.S. economy. And so the private sector has transferred a considerable amount of this healthcare risk to the employees. And so this has been done in a couple of ways. Number one is corporations only hire you for 32 hours a week, so that they have no legal mandate to offer you healthcare. Then there's also co-pays, which it used to be you might have paid very little or a very small amount for your monthly healthcare. Now that percentage that you're paying keeps increasing, right? And then the third element is that if you're self-employed, or then you're being given an option of unaffordable healthcare, or sort of an illusion of healthcare, with these high deductible policies where you have to spend $5,000 or $10,000 before you have healthcare insurance. And it's like, to me, that's almost like a kind of fraud, because you don't really have any healthcare until you've spent a small fortune. And so that's an enormous transfer of not just financial risk, but also, your health risk. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
And it's one of the biggest concerns that people have, is having satisfactory health care coverage based on the wages that they now make, because, small businesses can't afford it, etc. But we're about to go into the debt ceiling crisis that was on a 2-year moratorium here on Saturday when it expires. So, it'll be a big issue here in August. I'm sure we'll defer it and go around in games. But we're all screaming about being 28, maybe $30 trillion of national debt. But that's not the national debt. The national debt, because we have to put in unfunded liabilities, and that's healthcare. That's Social Security and healthcare. When we total that, it's $84 trillion in total, which makes that 30 seem rather small, and it is. The unfunded liabilities of commitments that we've made to the elderly and in our Social Security system is $84 trillion. How do you fund that? How do you fund that without the debt? It's unpayable and it's inextinguishable. So these are the realities, and that comes with risk. That says the ability for the government to pay it. They will pay it. There's no question, but they'll have to print the money to do it. So what will be the value of the money? There's your risk. That's your risk that's being transferred. It's being transferred to the currency.
Speaking of the government's tax revenues, the tax burdens have been shifted to high income labor. In other words, people who are creating a lot of value and getting paid a lot of money are paying most of the taxes, as opposed to the super wealthy, the predator capitalist, who has access to a huge number of tax breaks that are that are beyond the people making several $100,000. And I think I want to mention real quickly here. If you make $500,000 through your labor, you're in the top 1% of earnings. But does that mean that you can go buy a senator or have a lobby to get a special tax break for you alone, like a mega corporation? No, you're paying 40, 50, 60% in total tax burden. Meanwhile, the people making 100 million or 500 million, they have a huge number of offshore tax breaks, and they can run their income through Ireland, or as Gordon, as you mentioned before we started recording, they can just borrow their living expenses and let their capital pile up.
Charles, that is a huge issue today that I see very, very few people writing about, but it's a massive game that's going on. The very rich don't take their earnings like we do and then spend it on what they have exorbitant building costs, their yachts and everything else. They don't do that anymore. They go out and borrow the money at next to nothing, which is, if they're clever, it's a tax write-off because you can write off borrowed money depending how it's used. But they certainly don't pay tax on it. But they pay tax if they take money out of selling capital gains or selling product or wages of their fair share or whatever. They don't do that. They do it the other way because the rate at which they're paying that interest, and it's being devalued, deflated away because they're going to pay it back in less dollars tomorrow, is a smarter way of doing it. We don't. The average person hasn't got any of that capability that's happening in just masses, but we don't talk about it. And that's again a transfer of risk. They've transferred to us, we the taxpayers, what they've done, because that cheap money's coming from, quantitative easing and making cheap interest rates, which we're on the nut for.
One last comment on the tax burden is if a mega global corporation wants to put a fulfillment center or some facility in a particular county or state, then that local government bends over backward to give them some tax subsidies and various tax breaks. Meanwhile, what about small business? Where's the tax break and subsidy for them? There's none. And so that's an effective transfer of tremendously higher tax burdens and risk from global mega corporations to small business.
And we've really seen that with small business today going through the pandemic, where we've really helped major corporations, and I'm not trying to pick on the corporations, but they've been helped to reduce the risk, if you would, of the pandemic. But the small businessman who doesn't have access to the capital to some limited degree with these programs has had to shoulder the costs and have barely been able to hang on. And if we ever go into another wave, these small businessmen, they're running bars, they're running restaurants, are not going to make it. They don't have the capital capability of lending, and the banks are not going to lend to those small businessmen. They're just not. Whereas the corporations can get the money very, very easily or float the bonds to do it. So we've transferred risk to these small businessmen who are not going to be able, frankly, to make it. We're going to see, in my estimation, hundreds of thousands of small businessmen have failed, will fail over the next 2 years.
And then there's also been a transfer of speculative bubble risk from banks and financiers and large corporations to the people who are now basically gambling in the stock and housing markets in a desperate attempt to build up enough wealth to retire. If you can borrow $10 billion, you can basically skim guaranteed profits from the system. Or if I could borrow $1 billion and then use that, sell bonds and then buy back my own shares of my corporation and then liquidate my stock options. I mean, there are so many tricks that are basically guaranteed returns that the rest of us don't have access to. My final kind of comment on this is I want to look at systemic risk. In other words, all of these distortions and the sort of corruption, if you will, of predatory capitalism. It's weakened and of the system, the entire socioeconomic system that we live in. And it's created enormous levels of risk that most people don't seem to recognize. And what it's done is it's destabilized the market capitalism with a government that regulated that market capitalism to the benefit of the general public, right? That's been replaced by predatory capitalism, which is basically a destructive, destabilizing force. It's created enormous wealth income inequality, which is destabilizing, the social order. It's enabled pay to play political influence, destabilizing democracy. It's distorted the economy and financial system by concentrating power in the hands of the few and then forcing the government, because of the influence that capital can buy, there's moral hazards, so that too big to fail banks, too big to jail financiers, and so on, which has destroyed, undermined our legal system, right? That there's a two-tier legal system too. And it's really undermined the middle class, that the earnings are buying less and less, and the financial risks are undermining the security of the middle class. And I want to refer to two papers here that listeners can look up. One was a RAND study, which was called Income from 1975 to 2018. And they basically found that $50 trillion had been transferred from labor to capital. And by all the mechanisms that we described here, $50 trillion, this was basically extracted from the middle class and working class and transferred to the hands of financiers and the predatory capitalists. Then another study was called Monopoly versus Democracy that was published in Foreign Affairs magazine. And one of the factoids is, and we get sort of inured to this, like we stop realizing the impact of it, but the top 10% of American households earn 97% of the money generated by capital. In other words, by owning assets. So that means that the middle class basically has no income from capital, because they don't own enough capital, or their capital is stuck in super low interest bonds or other investments. And so the earnings from capital have now been concentrated to an unprecedented degree into the very top. And then that money allows them to buy political influence to protect their monopolies. And so this system is just is incredibly risky, because you can't run a system like this for very long before your social fabric just unravels.
Charles, I was watching a CNBC interview recently with Becky Quick, and she was interviewing Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. And I was stunned during the conversation that Munger actually said we needed to be mirroring the kind of control that the Chinese Communist Party has in China to run a stable, balanced economy, and better for business environment. I just about fell off my seat listening to it. And it's something that I've heard echoed by, I'll call them the elitist crowd, through Davos, and that is this new global reset, where corporations themselves have been continuing to offload risk, as we've just demonstrated it. And now they're looking, as they get bigger, as you're saying, they're very, very large. They have tremendous influence. And it's important to realize that they're no longer American companies. They're global companies. And we all know that. Their profits are global. They are operating in all the countries. And this is profoundly important to understand, because when I had over 30 years ago a number of opportunities. I worked for two very large corporations and presented on many occasions to the board of directors of both of those. And the audience and the board were dominantly foreigners. They were not Americans, and these were American corporations. And though we thought they were, but the board of directors were people managing major pension plans in China, in Japan, or large corporations in Germany, etc. But they were there, and they spoke beautiful English, but their perspective was not about America. Even though we thought these were American corporations, their perspective was a global one. And it was over 30 to 40 years ago, Charles. So today, these corporations look at where the profits are. And they see, for example, 1.4 billion people in China, and they say that's where the market is, and there's no middle class there that's going to create a middle class. Where are they going to invest? Where are they going to who are they going to transfer risk to so that they can take advantage of that? And a lot of the swings we're seeing and the changes that we're seeing are really about lowering the middle class standard in the United States and raising middle class in other places around the world, which are out of balance. And rightly so, by the way. It is out of balance, but I don't think we necessarily need to reduce the standard of living in America. But that's what's going on right now. We're reducing slowly and steadily the standard of living in America. And it's about the flow of capital and money from these very, very large corporations. They're not bad people, Charles. And don't for one moment my criticism leveling up. They're just doing what business people do. They make money the best way they can. The issue is not them. The issue is public policy. Public policy of regulating and defending the middle class who support an economy, who don't have the capital, to allow them to make the difference. Because at the end of the day, these corporations don't make money without a very well-to-do and thriving middle class. And if they can't find it, Henry Ford, when he made his Model T and Model A, he said he was pricing it so his employees could afford it because that's where the market was. And that's so true, to state the obvious. I didn't mean to get us a little off track, Charles, but I'm just trying to wrap it up here because we're coming to the end of our time. But I think it's very important that we understand that we're not criticizing corporations' transfer of risk. We're trying to make sure people understand what is going on and then have an opinion on it and do whatever you can to make sure your politicians are representing you fairly. Charles, any closing comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, I'd like to just sort of say that what you were describing was the incentives that are created by policy is what people respond to. And so what we're saying is all of the incentives are actually destructive in the system as it's now developed, right? That there's no incentive to invest in productive assets. The incentives are to speculate or create some sort of skim through the system, right? And to obfuscate risk with financial complexity. And all of these things we've been describing, they're all incentivized by the policies that are in place. And so I'll just return that there's huge financial risks have been transferred to the middle and working class. And we've created a protected and unprotected two-tier economy and on multiple levels. And that will tear our society apart. And that's a risk that I think very few people, other people are starting to understand, but they don't yet understand that the end game of that is extreme risk of social and political disorder.
Capitalism at its core is about savings and people saving money and companies saving monies, and then that money being invested into productive assets that in fact return and make money on that savings and grow, add, and raises the standard of living. That's how capitalism works. That's not what we have anymore. What we have is creditism, and that is we're creating money that's used for consumption, and we're a 70% consumption economy. And consumption does not return anything. Consumption is exactly that. It's consumed. And so we're not investing sufficiently and at a fast enough rate in productive assets that actually creates real wealth. And so what happens is you end up consuming more than you produce. And if you consume, capitalism is about getting more for less. And when you don't do that, you get less for more. And that's what inflation is. And that's what we're really facing right now. And we're seeing that because we've allowed ourselves to move away from capitalism, move these risks off, destroy the middle class. And consequently, we now are going to see rising inflation because we're using the creation of not credit anymore, direct money, actually helicopter money, which will eventually show itself in rising inflation. And it's no choice. We're locked into because of these policy decisions and incentives of you, as you correctly point out. Charles, we have to wrap right now. Great discussion. Enjoyed it very much. And we'll talk again next month. Could you tell our listeners how they could follow your readings and your writings?
Yeah, please visit me at of2minds.com. And thank you very much, Gordon.
Talk to you next month, Charles.
Okay.